Hi, my name is Lou Pierozzi, and today we're going to be discussing scale and how it relates to art. So the first thing we have to ask ourselves is really, how does it relate to art, and what does scale mean? Well, essentially it's artwork that can be manipulated. Its size can be manipulated, whether it's bigger or smaller, to change our perceptions about an object. And so I'd like to go ahead and start with, before I start really talking about how we use it in art, just a good way of thinking about scale, okay? Because we're really surrounded by scale everywhere. So I'd like to go ahead and use an example of Kevin Hart, okay? He's a really famous actor, comedian. He's been in a lot of really great movies, like Jumanji and a few others. And so I'd probably like to start with him. So if we compare him to Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, who's a very tall guy, I think Dwayne Johnson's about 6'5", we can sort of start to think about how scale comes into play, right? One man's smaller, another man's taller. And then we can really begin to start thinking about perspective in terms of scale. But, and here's another image of the two. When we bring in another individual, so this is Shaquille O'Neal, right next to Dwayne Johnson, you really start to think about scale and height, right? So we have Kevin Hart, a little shorter, Dwayne Johnson, who's very tall, and then Shaquille O'Neal, who's a very, very tall man. And again, if you walk into the room with any of these three gentlemen, you'd probably get a sense of scale by judging your own person or people that you already know. And here's sort of the difference between the two, okay? However, if we take a look at Shaquille O'Neal compared to a tree, and this is a small version of a tree, he's actually not very tall, right? Now, obviously, I've had to put these two images side by side. They're a little disproportionate, but you can sort of get the idea. And even this small tree, which is going to be bigger than Shaquille O'Neal, compared to a big sequoia tree, again, it's another way to compare objects. So even that small tree that's bigger than Shaquille O'Neal is compared to a sequoia tree is very tiny, right? So we've already got this preconceived notion about scale by taking a look at the world around us, okay, how it relates, and obviously even this tree isn't as big as a mountain, and so on and so forth. Now, there is an artist who really made scale fashionable. Now, we could talk about a lot of different artists throughout history. Michelangelo's David, for one. I mean, that thing is absolutely huge. It's 17.5 feet tall. But 500 years ago, he created that. But as contemporaries go, Claes Oldenburg might be a really good individual to just kind of pay attention to in terms of size matters, because that was his phrase or mantra. And so we're going to start to take a look at some of his work, and we're going to talk about representational artwork. Okay, so things that we are already familiar with, that's kind of in the known world, right? A car, a person, a tree. And Claes Oldenburg liked to take sort of these mundane objects that are usually created by humans and blow them up. Okay, so this is a clothespin, and it's 45 feet tall. Now, in the 1970s, people were very familiar with this, okay? So maybe you'd use this to hang clothes outside to get it to dry. I don't know. I don't know if today people are more familiar with this. I think they've kind of went out of fashion a little bit, but it gives you an idea if you have a point of reference that this thing is only a few inches tall. When you blow it up to scale, you're familiarized with it, you have an understanding of scale. And even this shuttlecock here at the Nelson's Atkins Museum in Kansas City, again, if you've ever played, I forget what game it is, but you get to hit this with a paddle. But here you get to see how large this is, and it's sort of, as the viewer takes a look at it, you really start to think, are giants playing this game with this object? Tony Tassel, he actually works out of Chicago, is also known for blowing up a lot of objects. And so here's an example of this giant eyeball, which we're all very familiar with. Again, good use of scale. I actually have a good friend. His name's Matt Federico, and he works for Tony Tassel on a lot of his different projects. And man, they're doing some really neat stuff out of that workshop. I don't know that he worked on the eyes. I should probably ask him, but he's definitely shown me some images of some really great things. But again, scale, here you really get a sense for it. Here's an old picture of me, quite a terrible picture of me. But again, this gives you an example of scale, okay? So we have this enormous figurine that's sort of about twice the size as I am. Here's another example of a giant picture. I mean, this goes back, I don't know, a long time from the, what is it, Emperor Constantine. And maybe you've seen this image before. It's really famous. But again, if you take a look at me in terms of the scale of it, it is really large. And that's just his head. If you look on the arms and you look to the left and to the right, those are parts of the full figure. At one time, it was actually a full figure. So that sense of scale, can you imagine the impression that leaves with you or the viewer? Really big sense of importance on this. And here's a painting that's really quite large as well. Okay. So again, when you're playing with blowing things up, your viewer is probably going to feel very small. Troll under the bridge in Seattle. Okay. Again, we don't know what trolls look like, but since it's so similar to the human figure, we can get a good idea about that. Another way we really get to see architecture sort of using scale, again, becoming very small. So the Hagia Sophia, if you go into this space, you're going to feel really small. I mean, those giant domes and that grand space, you sort of shrink. You're no longer your size because you feel like you're in this big cavernous space. All right. From the outside and the inside, it leaves a very big lasting impression on you. And there's sort of the dome. And we can think of any real tall building that's in a downtown area. Abu Dhabi, what is it? The Wiz Khalifa? No, I forget exactly. But the Sears Tower, if you're from Chicago, also known as Willis Tower, a massive building, right? So when you go down there, you really feel a sense of that scale. Here's St. Peter's Basilica. Michelangelo was the architect for this. And wow, I mean, going into this space, it's like a football stadium, absolutely massive. I mean, you really shrink down as a person in terms of size because you're just overwhelmed by the massive scale. And the Great Pyramids of Giza. And we can go on and on and on, right? So all these really big architectural buildings, they just leave an impression on you, right? Another thing we can begin to talk about is non-representational use of scale. So what's non-representational? Things that we're not familiar. The object isn't like a car or a house or a building or a person. It's sort of non-descriptive, okay? And I'd like to say about this PowerPoint, it's not I'm not covering everything you need to know about scale, but just enough to really get you to get the wheels thinking, especially if you are thinking about being an artist and how you're going to use scale. I think I give you enough of a taste of it that you can really use this to go ahead and create an artwork. Just another thing to think about. So let's take a look at non-representational. So when I was in Seattle, an artist that's really known for large sculpture is Richard Serra. And he creates these spaces that you almost sort of walk through. So when you walk through it, you're just overcome by the scale. Now, we don't know how to relate to these shapes, but one way we can think about it is our own personal size, right? So if something's much bigger than us, even though we may be unfamiliar with this object, it's still going to leave an impression relating to scale. And Alexander Calder's piece, again, this is downtown Chicago. Great example of non-representational. again, that sense of scale, right? You're still going to feel that even though you're unfamiliar to what the object is supposed to be. And then when I went to Venice and I went to the Biennale, I guess it's held every other year in Venice, Italy. If you ever get a chance to go, check it out. I mean, it was really neat. All the old churches, and in Italy, they're literally churches. I feel like it's every block there's a church. But when I was in Venice, they had these old buildings, had some really cool artwork, and so that was part of the excitement, was seeing these old churches and old buildings, and then sort of surrounded by contemporary art. And this was really large. You could actually go inside here and then kind of look up, if I remember correctly. I didn't take a picture of the doorway, but again, off to the side, you could see there, and I think you could go in there. I'm pretty sure, if I remember correctly. So we always usually, like I've shown you examples of blowing up scale, but we can actually go in the opposite direction, start to think about things that are small scale. An easy way to think about it is, is just sort of like these little train dioramas that maybe you've played with as a kid, or you've seen them at a museum. Again, we're really familiar with all these objects, the trains, the buildings, the trees. We're shrinking all of those sizes down, right? And so even for me, I look at this, it's kind of like a work of art. I kind of see it in that way, although I'll show you more examples of really well-known works of arts. But again, this is something that's very familiar to your average person, right? We can even think about old Japanese miniatures. This is really tiny. It's about the size of your thumb, these little things that were carved, and really just shrinking that scale down to very small pieces of wood. Charlie Simmons in the 1970s really made a career of creating these sort of small scale objects. They were really earthworks. And in the 1970s, he called them dwellings. And they were kind of unfired pieces of clay, and they would be found like on windowsills and stuff, and he would go through the process of making these, and then I think they would dissolve over time. Rain would get to them, rain, wind, and then they would slowly disappear. But while they existed, they were really interesting, and we became really familiar with it, right? The little doors, the little windows, the little steps. Again, we can see the bricks, okay, and get a sense of the cityscape there. And here's another image of that, okay? And we can get a sense for how small it is because we're familiar with how big the large bricks are on each side of that. And here's another example, more in a museum setting. Tetsuya Tanaka also is more of a contemporary artist. I really like his work a lot. I think he does like 3D printing of these small figurines. I think he draws them out and then creates them and then hand paints them. And he sees himself, I think as sort of as a sculptor, but as a photographer too, right? So he begins to play with scale in ways that we didn't think about it. So if we take a look at this piece, we have an iPhone box that's kind of been opened up, and it almost looks like it's a little iPhone store, right? And then you got people actually waiting outside to get in. And he would play with a lot of these different themes. So even if we take a look at this is kind of cute, right? We've got a traditional like sake set, and then there's some weird figure giving this little child maybe sushi or something, or I shouldn't say weird figure. There's probably a history to that figure there, but just not one that's familiar to me. I think it's something I should probably explore a little bit. But this is really interesting piece. And even taking broccoli, right, and having like this little dancing couple in the forest of broccoli. Or, a computer, and then, on the images you have like windows, and then you have these cars and these people hanging out, almost like an apartment building, right? Just really, unique way of thinking like an artist, really taking these themes that we're very familiar with and sort of shrinking them down. Asparagus, isn't it interesting what you could do with even asparagus? So I love this, like, you got this tractor where he's almost kind of cutting the asparagus down a little bit, okay? I kind of work with this theme too. I'm kind of mainly a ceramicist, and I like the idea of playing with scale. So I call these the double boilers. They're just 2 cups and a stand. But I'm playing with the same notions in some ways. So I have these windows. I have these little windows over here, and usually I have a doorway someplace else, and even these small brick beams. One thing I've always thought about too is even reducing the size of my rivets, but there's something about the bigger rivets that I like, so I've sort of decided to keep that into the style. And again, here I'm sort of playing with that as well. And you can tell that by the windows and the size of the bricks and the little entryway. Joshua Smith, he's really done some interesting work as a miniature artist. It just really, I mean, you could really be fooled by these, right? I mean, they're really about realism, hyper realism in a lot of different ways. So again, this is really sort of reducing the size. Well, I wanted to thank you for watching my presentation. Again, I'm Lou Pierozzi, and I hope you have a really great day. Thanks so much for watching.